Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen, and with us for our program today, Assemblyman Ed Rye. Ed Rye represents the 19th Assembly District in New York State, an Assembly District that includes Nassau County. Thank you folks on Long Island for joining us. And Ed Rye, it is nice to see you here today.
Nice to see you as well.
We got lots to get caught up on here at the state capitol. We are in it, and by it, I'm talking about the budget negotiations that are happening at the state capitol. The governor started things off with his budget proposal back in January, and now the Assembly has put its version on the table. The Senate expecting to put theirs on the table today. You kind of mix them all up, and everybody sits around a table, and you've got starting points now, and the serious talks, the serious negotiations begin.
Yep, absolutely. So after voting on the Assembly's one-house budget yesterday, and obviously some of those big items that were kicked off by the governor, like minimum wage and paid family leave were in there, as well as some of the things that the Assembly majority has thrown out, including a tax increase, but a lot of talk, obviously, about education funding, about infrastructure spending. So a lot of work to do over these next few weeks leading into April 1st.
Those last couple that you mentioned there, those are the ones that are near and dear to people's hearts. Those are the funding streams that really make a difference in the lives of the people you represent. Education funding and infrastructure. I mean, you're talking about roads and bridges and water pipes and things like that, but also education funding, state aid to school districts. There's no place where that's more important, I know, than to the people of Long Island.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, Long Island is a very expensive place to live, high property taxes and all that, and we certainly recognize that getting our share of education funding is what makes a difference in hopefully keeping those property taxes stable, but making sure we have the best funded schools. And we know we do education right on Long Island, but we want to fight for our fair share of that education funding. So the main theme this year is the gap elimination adjustment, and we want the gap elimination adjustment to go away once and for all in this budget. Both one-house budgets, unlike the executive proposal, have proposed to eliminate the gap elimination adjustment this year. So that's going to be the main priority for the next few weeks, is to see that gone.
I'm going to say that there's probably a lot of people watching this program that have no idea what gap elimination adjustment even means. But suffice it to say, about several years ago, the state was in hard times come budget talks, and had to cut, to make ends meet, cut some funding for school districts, right?
Sure. Yes, and the gap elimination adjustment, really, to simplify it, was each school district's share of that state budget deficit that we were facing going back a few years. Obviously, the state is in better financial shape. That budget deficit no longer exists. And thus, really, the reasoning goes, there's not really a justification to carry forward that gap elimination adjustment. And we're talking about even under the governor's proposal, which would eliminate the gap elimination adjustment over 2 years. After this budget, you'd still have close to $80 million outstanding to Nassau and Suffolk counties. So obviously a big priority for us on Long Island is to get that wiped out this year.
That sounds like that would be a good thing both for the school districts and the education of the children, but also for property taxpayers,
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. Absolutely. It's at the end of the day, obviously those are the two funding streams coming into the schools. So when one is short, the other one tends to increase. So it will benefit both families that have children in the schools, but also those who don't, who hopefully will see more stable property taxes.
On the infrastructure funding, there was guys here at the state capitol last week, guys and gals, wearing orange T-shirts, tons of them. I mean, they were everywhere to be seen here at the capitol, and they were the highway superintendents from all across the state and workers and such, and they were here with a pretty simple message. The infrastructure of the state, it's an older state in the union, and the infrastructure, the water pipes, the sewer pipes, as well as roads and bridges, the culverts, are all in need of an awful lot of work.
Yeah, and I think that that obviously needs to be a priority, especially when you're coming out of a tough economic time. That's something that tends to get put off. Is that rehabilitation and maintenance of roads and bridges, especially also coming off of a few real tough winters. Thankfully, this one hasn't been too bad, but the previous two were really rough on our roads. So, you know, it was great to see all those folks up here, you know, fighting for the CHIPS program and getting money to our local towns and villages and counties to do work on those roads and make sure we have, you know, safe local roads for people to commute to work, for the school buses to travel on. At the end of the day, if you don't have your local roads in good shape, not much else is going to happen. So.
Yeah. Again, the things that are important to the people watching here. So you've got, those are just two examples of the negotiations and the talks that are going on right now. As you look at what the Assembly and the Governor and the Senate have going on, and you mentioned minimum wage and all these other issues, do you feel confident that maybe this will be another on-time budget again this year? That because the state was for years without being able to do that. You thinking you'll be able to hit March 31st this year?
I think it'll be on time or close to on time. I think the education funding piece of it is going to be critical in that, just, you know, figuring out where the regional shares break down, depending on what money gets globally put into education on how it gets divvied up. Really, I think that's going to be a major thing. The Senate has drawn that line in the sand, saying gap elimination done this year or no budget. But, you know, the Assembly put that in their one house as well. So hopefully there can be an agreement to eliminate that. And I think if there is, we'll see another on-time budget. And
of course, there are other educational issues too that are on the table outside of the budget discussions. Common Core has been a huge issue here at the state capitol, and something that you've been very much part of that discussion here over the last couple of years. At the beginning of this legislative session, in fact, you stood with your colleagues and talked about the need to reform overall the way the education policy of this state is put together. Let's take a look at some remarks you made at that press conference, and then we'll come back. We'll talk a little bit more about the future of education here in the state of New York with Ed Ra.
What we're here to do today is to both reiterate and introduce points on what we think needs to happen next in education. 2 years ago, we stood down in the Legislative Office building on the heels of 14 education hearings that members of our conference participated in throughout the state, and we put together a report, and we put together what we called at the time the Apple Plan. Fast forward to December 2015, and the task force report that just came out from the Governor's Common Core Task Force, and there's sections of that read very much like that report we put out 2 years ago. We want to reiterate our commitment to working towards getting this right for our children, and I think the proof has been over the last 2 years that these small measures that have been adopted just haven't worked. They haven't solved the problems, and obviously they haven't restored the faith of our educators and our parents in our education system, and you'll need to look no further than the 200,000 plus opt-outs that happened last year when the state tests came about.
Personally, I always think one of the reasons that parents are frustrated when they have issues with their kids' education experience is that, who do you complain to? Is it the teacher in the classroom? Is it the administration of the school, the principal? Is it the superintendent of the district, the Board of Education? Or do you want to come to Albany and talk to the legislature? Or would it be the governor's office? Or the Board of Regents? Or the education department? I mean, there's just so many layers to this onion. And I don't know if that's part of the problem or if it would be even worse without all that. But what are some of the changes you're talking about, the things that you think would make a better difference, a better education for New York students?
Well, I think part of the problem, and you just alluded to it, is a major sense of frustration amongst parents. And we need to restore their faith in our state education department and in the system overall. And I think that, you know, the governor's task force put together a report. It identified a lot of things, but was very short on solutions. And the governor has kind of passed the buck a little bit to the state education department, saying, you know, they need to work on these recommendations. But at the end of the day, there are things that were done legislatively and need to be fixed legislatively, in particular teacher evaluations, decoupling them from our state testing, and ensuring that we're not penalizing our districts. So we need to go in and fix that. That's in law right now. The Board of Regents have put off using the state test in teacher evaluations for the next 4 years, but it still sits in law as it did beforehand. So that's a major priority of mine post-budget. We need to go in, we need to repeal that teacher evaluation system. We need to put forth one that once and for all will be there for the long haul so the districts can negotiate plans and have some predictability. I've been using the analogy, it feels like Charlie Brown getting the football pulled out from in front of him because we've changed the APPR, the teacher evaluation plan, 3 or 4 times now legislatively, and every time they've gone through a negotiation, gotten a plan approved by the state education department, it seems like the rules change once again. So we need to get this right once and for all, and I think that our entire education system will be better for it.
There must be other states that evaluate their teachers and have some kind of system in place that doesn't negatively have teachers so-called teaching to the test and not giving the best education to the students. There must be states that have something in place.
Sure. There are different models to look at, throughout the United States, but obviously many states somewhat under No Child Left Behind, but in particular under Race to the Top, there were some requirements, in particular the tying of testing to teacher evaluations. At the federal level, those rules were now late last year loosened a little bit, so it has given an opportunity to go back and pull back on that linkage between those two, and that's what we need to do. We can look to what's going on in other states, but really at the end of the day, I think we have a great education system in New York, and let's be leaders, not followers.
Yes, here you go. And so that's a post-budget discussion you hope to have here at the state capitol.
Yeah, absolutely. Just especially for consistency's sake, we were talking about all these issues in the budget last year. Yeah. They didn't belong in the budget then, and they don't belong in the budget now, although I'd be happy to get them done before the budget. But being realistic and knowing the priorities when you get into March are the budget, I hope it's something that we really look at post-budget.
And we're down to our last couple minutes already, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask about the events of the end of 2015 with the conviction of a couple of former state legislative leaders. Nothing has happened yet here at the state capitol in terms of reforming the culture, some call it the culture of corruption at the state capitol, in changing the way the houses, the Assembly and the Senate operate to prevent the legislative leaders from doing that again.
Sure. Yeah, and we have an ethics bill that the majority is bringing to the floor, and it does some decent things that may be helpful, but it doesn't get at what I think is really the common theme. If you look at those two trials, common theme was centralized power in a select few, and that's something we need to get at to really reform Albany, get away from the 3 men in the room culture, get away from that centralized power in those few leaders, as well as obviously one that's been big is pension forfeiture for convicted officials. We need to stop the partisan bickering back and forth in that. Get something everybody can agree on, get that passed so that it has to be a constitutional amendment, so obviously it has to pass the successive legislature, but if we don't do it this year, we lose basically another 2 years to do that.
So how do you decentralize that kind of power from, let's say, the Speaker of the Assembly? Term limits for legislative leaders, or how do you give more back to the rank and file?
I think it's term limits for legislative leaders. I think it's equalizing resources so that those legislative leaders don't have that to hold over the head of the rank and file members. Things of that nature, I think, would go a long way towards helping get away from that environment.
All right. Well, that's going to be it for us today. Let you folks know real quick how you can get a hold of your representative at the state capitol. You can get a hold of Ed Rah at his district office in Garden City. Dial 535-4095 or send an email at the address you see right there on the screen, rahe@assembly.state.ny.us. And Ed Rah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having
me. Pleasure
to
see you. Thank you folks, too, for spending your time. We'll hope to see you soon for our next edition of Assembly Calendar.